This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast for joining us today. Links to learn more about Michael and his American Revolution podcast can be found at his website, pod.amrevpodcast.com, as well as in the show notes. Now, there is not a single movie that I can think of that causes more consternation and debate among historians and history fanatics alike, like Mel Gibson's 2000 movie, The Patriot. Some hate this movie with the heat of 1,000 burning suns, and some really love it. Is there something in between, though? Does this movie get some things right, but also take some major liberties? Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast will take us through the real events represented by this controversial movie. I can't wait. This is the movie that must be talked about if you are going to have a historical-based movie podcast, so let's dive in. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. You can also connect to me and people who want to learn more about movies they watch on Facebook and Twitter. You can contact me there or just send an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Michael Troy of the Great American Revolutions podcast to talk about the year 2000, dare I say, classic film, The Patriot. The movie stars Mel Gibson, Heath Ledger, Adam Baldwin, and many others in a fictionalized, or maybe more accurately, highly fictionized telling of the Southern theater of the American Revolution. Michael is going to guide us through the events depicted in this movie, what Mel got right, what he did wrong, what really happened, and in the end, does Hollywood hate history? Now, as I said, Michael is the host of the American Revolution podcast, which can be found at www.amrevpodcast.com. Michael is also the volunteer organizer for the History Camp Philadelphia, which will start in May of 2020. And that can also be found at historycamp.org/Philadelphia. Michael, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast and what you got interested and how you got interested in the American Revolution?
Hi, Steve. Yeah, I've been doing the American Revolution podcast for about 2.5 years now. We're going through the war. We started with the French and Indian War and looking at a lot of the pre-war protests, moving through the war and the era chronologically. We're up to about mid-1777 right now, so we still have a lot of years to go. And of course, all of the Southern campaign is at the end of the war, so haven't gotten to all of that yet. I've been interested in the American Revolution for most of my life. And, at the risk of revealing my age, I really got involved as a kid during the bicentennial when the American Revolution was a big event across the country. I lived in the greater Philadelphia area, and it was an especially exciting time to be here in the Philadelphia area during the bicentennial. A few years ago, I really just started doing a deep dive into the American Revolution. I've always read lots of books about it, but I really wanted to get into a lot of the nitty gritty and decided to do the podcast as a way of sharing what I was learning about the war and the era.
Let's start off our conversation today with maybe giving us a little bit of a background on the Southern theater of the Revolutionary War, because most people are probably most familiar with the fighting that was happening near Boston and New York City and basically areas, say, north of Maryland. But the Southern theater was a major, major focus of the war. Maybe you can set that up for us and what was going on and maybe some dates just to get us a benchmark for what we'll be talking about today.
Sure. The war, as everyone I hope knows, began in Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in 1775. And the early part of the war was really fought in New England and the Middle States. There wasn't a whole lot going on in the South. There was a little bit of fighting between uh, Florida, which remained with the Tories, and Georgia, the Patriots. Uh, General Cornwallis in 1776 attempted to take Charleston, South Carolina, but was rebuffed. So the British didn't really spend a whole lot of time in the South. Uh, Once the French got involved in the war after the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the British really changed their strategy in 1778 and going forward, in that they really didn't want to focus on capturing all of the American colonies again. They really wanted to just protect what they had and go focus on other more valuable colonies around the world that the French and the Spanish were at that point threatening. So in 1779, the British captured Savannah, Georgia, and over the next couple of years, spent much of their focus in North America trying to retake the Carolinas and Virginia, thinking that those were more loyal colonies that had a greater population of loyalists living in them, and that they would be relatively easy to retain while they focus most of their attentions elsewhere. So we see General Cornwallis leading an army through the Carolinas through much of 1780 and 1781, culminating, of course, in the Battle of Yorktown, Virginia, where he has to surrender his entire army. And that battle effectively ended the war, although it really did linger on for another year or two until the treaty was finally signed.
So the Southern Theater really is the bookend of the end of the war.
Yeah, it really is everything that's happening in the last 2 years of the war, so to speak. The That's where all the fighting had moved to, um, yeah, for the final part of the war.
At this point, let me give a quick short plot summary of the movie, and then we'll dig into a couple of the juicy details of the movie. Now, the star of the movie, or the main protagonist of the movie, is Captain Benjamin Martin, who is played by Mel Gibson. He's a veteran of the French and Indian War, which was fought about 10 to 15 years previously to the start of this movie. He's called to the South Carolinian Governmental Assembly to vote on funding for the Continental Army. Martin is done with fighting. He's sort of burned out the whole thing with conflict. There's some subtext that maybe he had participated in some sort of massacres and things that he wasn't necessarily proud with. He's living his life peacefully as a widower yeoman farmer on a gigantic South Carolinian plantation. Incidentally, although he runs a massive plantation in pre-Civil War South Carolina, he doesn't own any slaves. They make it very clear in the movie that he has paid African American workers, so that might be an issue that we will come up in our conversation. Colonel Martin's life gets turned upside down when the British raid his farm. They kill one of his sons and burn down his home. While his house is on fire, he runs back in to grab his gear from the French and Indian War, including a war tomahawk that will be a main character in the film, and then he gets down to business. There's many wonderful scenes of Benjamin Martin conducting raids, guerrilla-style attacks from his swampy redoubt, and much, much more. There's also, you can't have a movie like this without familial conflict between Benjamin and his son, played by Heath Ledger, who Martin never wants his son to join the Continental Army in the first place. And again, I won't give up too much, but the movie climaxes with a version of the historical Battle of the Cowpens. let's start diving into some of these specifics. I guess the first one, since it really is laid out very early in the movie, is slavery was obviously an issue. And I'm imagining that the filmmakers wanted to have him as not a slave owner to try and not make that a big deal of the movie, which it kind of makes it into a big deal anyways. But what was the situation of slavery in the southern United States in the late 1700s?
Yeah, I think the movie makers really were trying hard to make the Patriots look as good as possible and make the British as bad as possible. So I think both sides get exaggerated throughout the movie. And yeah, a big part of that is the way they treat slavery. The idea that a large plantation owner in South Carolina would not have slaves is fairly unrealistic in my mind. Slavery was pretty pervasive. There were some free blacks living in South Carolina at the time, and this is actually a change from the early 1800s when it became illegal for free blacks to live inside the state. State officials decided that they were a threat to um, a potential slave revolt and forced all free blacks to leave the state under pain of being re-enslaved. Now, that was not the case during the American Revolution. There were free blacks living in South Carolina. There are even a couple of cases of African Americans owning slaves themselves in South Carolina at the time. But again, these were very, very rare. The norm was for almost all African Americans living in the state to be slaves and be owned by their plantation owners. It would have been very difficult economically for someone to free all of their slaves and then rehire them as paid laborers, as seems to be the case in the movie.
Now, the next thing that we probably should clear up is that if you go and Google Colonel Benjamin Martin, you're not going to find a historical character or a real historical person by that name. Who was the historical people that, because he was sort of a composite character, what characters were embodied in this Benjamin Martin?
Yeah, I think that right. He is an amalgam of several characters, and some of it's just made up out of whole cloth. A big person that a lot of people say is central to the character is that of Colonel Francis Marion, who was known as the Swamp Fox. Marion was a Patriot colonel who was involved in the war from the very beginning. Uh, he controlled militia that lived in the swamps of South Carolina and during the British occupation was engaged in numerous hit and raid operations against the British Army. Another character who I think he's somewhat based on is a man named Thomas Sumter. Again, he was a Patriot South Carolina planter who was a militia leader and was also a big part of the Patriot resistance in South Carolina.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Another issue that comes up very early on is, what was the general feeling for independence in South Carolina specifically, because that's where most of the movie is focused on. Were This is a little bit later in the war. Things have been going on for quite a long time in the northern part of the colonies. What were people in places like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, what were they thinking about this whole independence movement?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's another interesting thing about how this movie plays out. The very beginning of the movie supposedly takes place, I think, in early 1776, before the Declaration of Independence. And at that time, there was a little more division within the colonies about the direction that they should be going. There was a fairly substantial Tory population in South Carolina. Most of them, those who were in favor of loyalism, tended to be the Scotch Irish who were living in the western part of the state. The Eastern establishment around Charleston tended to be more patriot. So there were some divisions. One of the things that really bothered me about this movie in terms of reflecting reality was that Benjamin Martin considered himself a patriot or seemed to, but refused to fight in the war and refused to go to war against the king. And that was really a loyalist position. That would have had him branded as a Tory at the beginning of the war. Um, Refusal to fight, refusal to join a militia, things like that, um, would have likely meant that he would have been expelled from the colony and that his plantation would have been seized by the Patriot Committee of Safety that ran the state at the time. That's what happened to most people who did not want to take up arms against the king and support the Patriot cause. They were forced to leave the colony. And because of that, by 1780, the colony was pretty solidly patriot. If you did harbor any sort of loyalist views, you kept real quiet about them and were not letting anybody know what your true feelings were. Uh, that is why the Patriots were able to hold on to the South and the Carolinas during this period. They had effectively shut down any kind of loyalist organization. And so by the time the British regulars got there, there was really no one to join them.
Yeah, that's really is how the movie portrayed him, as a fence sitter. And you're saying that fence sitting just was not an option?
No, fence sitting was not an option. You had to take an oath of loyalty to the Patriot cause. All men of his age would have been expected to be members of the militia, and he was apparently a militia officer. Before the war, he would have been expected to behave as a militia officer during the war and take up arms, and not doing so would have probably been branded a Tory.
One thing before we really dig into some specific scenes is that's an overarching theme of this entire movie is the guerrilla war aspect of the fighting in this movie that they portray, that he's fighting from cover. He's specifically going after officers in hit and run raids. They're really trying to make a marked difference between the way Martin fought and his son, who's fighting in the more traditional lining up, redcoats on one side, uh, the Continentals on the other side. They shoot at each other, guys fall down, they move a little closer to each other. Was this a realistic portrayal of how fighting was being done in the South? Was there a lot of guerrilla fighting, what they might have called back then Indian fighting?
Yeah, I think there was. Yeah, it was called Indian style fighting in a lot of cases. Um, that was very common with local militia that really didn't have the numbers to stand up and go head to head against regulars. And it wasn't just in the South. This was a very common form of fighting in New England and New Jersey. We see it a lot of places where there's just a lot of hit and run tactics. The idea of standing up to an army face to face in a field was really when you wanted to stop that army from going somewhere and defeat them. The Americans throughout the war, uh, at least after a few early tries, realized that they weren't going to stop the British from marching wherever they wanted to march. The British were just too powerful and too well trained and organized to do that. What they could do was make their lives absolutely miserable whenever they tried to march anywhere. And there would be constant harassment, guerrilla style shooting attacks on the British soldiers, especially when they occupied an area. They would have to send out foraging parties or parties to communicate with other armies. They'd have to send messengers out. So the local militia focused on making it impossible for the army to operate in that way, and they really had to hunker down in large camps in order to keep their men secure. Now, I will say also, uh, the British are sometimes portrayed as being these incompetent oafs who simply stand up in their lines and shoot back at the guerrillas and um, fail miserably at it, and that really was not the case. The British, of course, were trained to fight conventionally, but there were a great many officers who supported unconventional Indian-style warfare, if you will, um, and engaged in many of the same tactics that the colonial militia did, using a lot of hand-to-hand combat, shooting behind trees, all that sort of thing.
One other character who we should really mention before we get started, because he's the main antagonist of the film. He's called Tavington in this film, but he is based on a real person in the historical record. Why don't you speak a little bit about this Tavington character? Because again, he's another fictionalized character, but he's does play a role. The real person plays a role, a pretty major role in the actual fighting.
Yeah, Colonel Tavington seems to be pretty strongly based on a real-life colonel named Bannister Tarleton, who was a very aggressive, up-and-coming officer during the war. Tarleton was actually the man who captured Charles Lee in New Jersey early in the war. Uh, there was kind of uh, two different ways that British officers approached the American Revolution. A great many of the officers were actually Whigs, and they felt some sympathy for the way the colonies had been treated, and many of them actually opposed the war, but felt it their duty as officers to go forward with it once war had been declared. You can put men like some of the leaders like General Howe and General Clinton, and even to some extent General Cornwallis in that category. Then there were other officers, and Colonel Tarleton is one of them, certainly one of the most extreme, who said, you know, we support the king, period. We're not going to debate politics. These men are traitors. Traitors deserve to be hanged. In fact, a few decades earlier, they probably would have been drawn and quartered. Hanging was too good for people like this. So they treated them as such. They treated them very horribly. And this was not just in terms of hate or vengeance or something. This was a policy of the British government. You used terror tactics so that people did not even think about stepping out of line against the king and questioning British rule. When people did, you went after them. You went after them hard, and you killed them, killed their families, and took anything of value that they ever had. If you look at, for example, the Scottish Battle of Culloden, which took place only a couple decades earlier, prior to the Revolution in Scotland, there was a bunch of Scottish rebels that rose up and became known as the Jacobite Uprising. The British defeated them at the Battle of Culloden, went through the battlefield, slaughtered every wounded person they came across, killed all their prisoners, identified who was a rebel, and went back to their hometowns and seized their homes, raped their wives, killed their children, all sorts of really, really horrible stuff. And that's the way you put down a rebellion. So there were a lot of British officers that came from that school of thought, and Tarleton was certainly one of them. He was known for killing prisoners on the battlefield, people that were trying to surrender. Um, there became something known as Tarleton's Quarter. Quarter at the time meant surrender, and Tarleton's Quarter meant there was no surrender. You fought, you killed, or you died. Those were the choices.
It's interesting because there definitely is an archetype in the common thought and definitely in the media of the effete, bloodless, absolutely ruthless British officer, like we see in how General Simcoe in the recent show Turn about Washington spying. You get that archetype that's very common in American media that I would imagine isn't very popular in British media.
Yeah, I would think so. And I mean, you could really apply this to almost any officers in any war. You have some that really get into the brutality of war, and they see it as a viable way of compelling people to bend to their will. They're not there to make friends. They're not there to debate issues. They are there to enforce what, their higher ups have told them must be enforced against people who are trying to kill them for enforcing the law. So they tend to get very brutal, and it does happen. But again, this is, I would not apply this to every British officer. There were some who felt that way. There were some who felt quite differently.
Okay, now let's have a little fun here. Let's start out with, let's go negative right away. What were some of the things that this movie just really got wrong with the historical record? What's the things that, as a aficionado of the American Revolution, somebody who's been studying it, basically your entire life, what really got under your skin with this movie?
Yeah. Well, aside from the slavery thing and the treating a neutral as not being a Tory, those were two things that we've already talked about. One of the other things was the way combat seemed to work in the movie. We see a lot of shooting at direct individuals back and forth, and that was actually pretty unusual. Muskets were notoriously inaccurate at the time, which is why soldiers stood in a line and fired in volleys, because shooting one gun at one person had it was pretty shocking if that actually hit someone. The balls went all over the place. They didn't have rifles for the most part. So we see a lot of, like, especially even pistol shooting from like 50, 100 yards away and actually hitting someone. That was just ridiculous. Interesting. There were rifles that were used during the war, and the Americans actually did get a reputation for being sharpshooters, but those were always a small contingent of actual soldiers who were fighting on the war. And if you want me to get into the details as to why, I find it interesting anyway. Why didn't everyone use rifles? Rifles were accurate and could actually hit a target, and muskets couldn't. So why is everyone using muskets? There are actually several important military reasons why. Muskets were hunting weapons. They were not typically used in combat because they took a lot longer to load. It could take 2 or 3 minutes to load a rifle because you literally had to hammer down the bullet down the barrel, because it had to fit very tightly against the rifling in the barrel in order to work. And probably more importantly than the reloading time was the fact that after you had fired 7 or 8 shots out of your rifle, it became covered with a residue, so that it was literally impossible to shove another bullet down the gun until the gun was cleaned. So after 6 or 7 shots, all your riflemen were out of the battle. They weren't going to be firing anymore. So that made rifles less than acceptable for most combat. So yes, there were some riflemen. It would have been believable that a few militiamen were using rifles, and they were used very effectively as a component of a larger army during the war. But most men did not aim and shoot. They fired in volleys. They fired at very close combat, and that was the only way you were actually going to be able to kill anyone. Secondly, and this was actually surprised that they didn't be more realistic in this way, combat in the American Revolution did not involve a great deal of shooting. There were usually a few volleys, but the volleys were on the way toward a charge and hand-to-hand combat. The British very strongly used the bayonet and the sword to kill their enemy. This is something that changed in the 19th century when rifling got better. But during the American Revolution, a great many of the casualties were caused by bayonet and sword. This was actually people getting in each other's faces, engaging in hand-to-hand combat, beating and stabbing at each other. And I always get annoyed when we see Colonel Havington having the prisoners shot on Harrison's plantation after the battle. You did not waste bullets shooting somebody at point blank range. You pulled out your bayonet and you stabbed them. That's how you killed somebody. So a lot of stuff like that.
Would that have been something that kind of combat, of hand-to-hand combat, fighting with a bayonet, those are skills you have to learn in a professional military? Is that one of the things that put the Americans at a great disadvantage because they weren't trained in that style of combat, or they weren't trained until much later in the conflict?
Yeah, not only were they not trained, a lot of them had guns that didn't have bayonets, which put you at a real disadvantage in a
Yeah.
bayonet fight. Um, yeah, the way you would fight with bayonets is you maintain your lines because you don't want people getting around you and stabbing you in the back. You have to stand shoulder to shoulder with the man next to you to prevent the enemy, keep the enemy in front of you where you can stab them. Um, the British tend to put its largest and strongest men in special grenadier companies, which were experts in bayonet fighting. And yes, if you can go after men who, even if they're properly armed with bayonets, are not really experienced with taking a really heavy piece of wood and metal and jamming it into somebody else's chest, which is really a hard thing to do if you think about it, and not a natural act. If you're not trained in that, you're going to be at a real disadvantage. And the British spent a great deal of time training their regulars in hand to hand combat.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I never realized that. So that really is a throwback and a continuation of combat that was, I mean, almost medieval, but definitely throwing back to the early modern period of Spanish units like the tercios, and where the gun was all, the shooting part of the gun was almost secondary to, putting something pointy into the other person's chest.
Yeah, I view the Revolution as a real transition period between medieval and modern war. Because of that, bullets were coming a little more important, but it still was not the primary source of fighting. The primary source was, yeah, jamming, pointing things into somebody else's body. Um, so it really wasn't until the early 1800s when they developed the Minet ball and improved rifling to the point where soldiers weren't able to run fast enough to get close to engage with the enemy in hand-to-hand combat before they could be mowed down. Because once you had rifles that you could load relatively quickly, the hand-to-hand combat became less relevant, and that's why you see less of it in the Civil War. But during the American Revolution, it was still a very big thing.
What are some other parts of this movie that really irked you, or maybe it's too strong of a word, but parts that you really hated?
Yeah, I mean, I do enjoy the movie. I mean, I view it kind of as fiction. It's not meant to be a documentary or anything. So, despite its faults, it is an enjoyable movie for me. But yeah, I mean, the style of warfare, the treating the patriots as 100% good, wholesome, wonderful people who are being victimized by these horrible brutes who had no redeeming value at all, that sort of thing, just kind of irritated me.
There's one scene that people always come back to and discuss, is when Tavington locked up the entire town
Mm.
into a church and then set the church on fire, which definitely throws back to maybe some of Mel Gibson's other films as an homage. But would that have been something that would have happened at all specifically in the American Revolution, but even in warfare at that time period?
Something like that was pretty unheard of. There was a very strong view, attitude, whatever you want to call it, toward going after civilians. It really wasn't done. And even when civilians were supporting the local guerrillas, you wouldn't do something like that to them. Now, there are cases of British burning people alive in buildings, but in most cases, those were times when the Americans had put sharpshooters in the house that were actually trying to kill the soldiers. They would rush the house, set it on fire, and burn the people alive. But those were enemy combatants. They weren't innocent civilians. Innocent civilians were not massacred, not only not in a gruesome way like burning, they were not hanged, they were not shot, they were not treated that way. And I think that really was an exaggeration, an attempt to make the British seem a little bit more evil for the sake of the movie. The only case I've actually heard of where that happened, where civilians were put into a church that was locked up and set on fire happened in World War II by the Nazis. It may have happened other times, but that's the only example I've ever come across.
Yeah, that scene was kind of, I guess, shocking to me in that chances are in a town in the eastern part of South Carolina, it would have been an Episcopal church, which was basically state property. You're burning the king's property full of civilians. That seems very odd.
Yeah, as I said, I can't imagine that ever happening, even um, in other churches that were not Anglican. It was not common to completely destroy them. The British would abuse those sorts of churches. Typically, a Quaker church or a Presbyterian church or something like that would be used. I know one in Boston was used as a horse stable. So they did certainly abuse them, but they did treat Anglican churches uh, as churches and tended not to treat them as they would churches of that were not part of the Church of England.
Now, we've talked a little bit about what the movie got wrong. What are some of the things that you liked about this movie? What do you think that it really got to something in this theater of the war?
Uh, yeah, well, it did try to capture the idea that we were really resisting tyranny. Um, the idea of guerrilla fighting and resistance to the regular army was a theme throughout the war. In truth, it did try to follow the basic guidelines of what did happen in the actual war, the French alliance, the uh, there's a famous the battle at the end of the movie or near the end of the movie where Gibson lines up the militia in the center of the line, says that they have to fire 2 shots before they can run away. And he does that in order to get the British to charge into the center, and then he can flank them on both sides and completely decimate the British army. That really happened at the Battle of Cowpens. It was a trick that had been developed by General Daniel Morgan. Um, so it's nice to see, even if Benjamin Martin got credit for someone else's work, that it was a real tactic that was used in the war.
So let's and then the last scene of the movie is at Yorktown, and they play up the relationship between the French. It's somewhat untrustworthy, and then they come to at least work together. How did they portray Yorktown at the end? To me, that felt a little bit like just an add-on that they had to somehow wrap up the movie some way. It felt a little contrived or maybe forced. But how did you feel that ending was?
Yeah, well, the Battle of Cowpens, of course, was the exciting ending to the movie, essentially, or the what it had been building up to the whole time. But the war wasn't over then, so they had to kind of have an afterword to say, all right, well, here's where it finally ends. Of course, in reality, the French had not really been involved in the war. They got involved in 1778, just before the Southern Campaign began, but they did not send large numbers of land troops in until late in the war. And they were finally able to be put to use at Yorktown. It was a great time of cooperation between the French army and the Continental Army. Um, and capturing Cornwallis's army there is what effectively ended the war. So you kind of have to have that as a bookend to finish out the war. That we don't all this fighting, and finally it ends here.
So overall, with this movie, there's definitely some really bad parts, but some good parts. What do you think? Is this a case where Hollywood hated history, or do you think it broadly got it right? And as a movie, it was a good movie. What would be your final assessment?
Yeah, there's so few movies that even talk about the American Revolution. I have to be grateful when there finally is one, I guess. Um, I thought it was a pretty good movie. I thought they were lazy at times. They tended to be using some themes I see very common in other Hollywood movies. You know, the reluctant warrior who holds back and then is finally drawn into the war and becomes the great hero. You know, movies like Shenandoah or Friendly Persuasion. There's a lot of movies out there that have done that sort of thing in the past. So, in some ways, it was a bit lazy, but you know, it was a fun movie. It showed the events of the war, what happened, um, gave some idea of what it was like for the people going through it. So, you know, I liked it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Michael. I've learned a ton about the American Revolution and specifically the Southern theater, just in this short conversation. So I sincerely appreciate it.
Okay, well, yeah, I was glad for being available. And thank you for having me on.
And before you go, is there anything maybe you want to share? Any projects coming up that you're particularly excited about?
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I've been really involved in History Camp Philadelphia. We're bringing History Camp to the city for the first time. For those of you unfamiliar with History Camp, it started in Boston a few years ago, and it's really a chance for history amateurs to get together and share the vast wealth of knowledge that we have with each other, and it really results in an entertaining day. It's an event for adults, despite the name History Camp. Some people think it's for kids. It is an event for adults, and they go on all over the country. There's one in Virginia. There's several more that may be starting up in the next few months or years. So that's something I've been very heavily involved in. And beyond that, I'm just putting out my podcast every single week. That keeps me plenty busy.
Well, I want to thank you again, and hopefully we can, maybe they'll come out with some more Revolutionary War based movies, and we can talk about them too.
I sure hope so. The sesquicentennial, the 250th anniversary of the war, is coming up in about 6 years. So I'm hopefully that'll generate some excitement, get some more things out there in the media.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks much.